All right, so here we are, January 5th. A little bit of snow this morning, and a little bit later than yesterday. I'm still trying to find the right time to do this. I thought that maybe in between the kids and our animals are often barking already. There's a squirrel in the back, so if you are a regular to the show, you know that my animals are crazy. So hopefully he doesn't go nuts. I may have to get up and go let him out. I'm going to. Vinny, you're terrible. All right, sorry about that. I'm back. So let's jump in. Psalm chapter 4 is our psalm for the day. And I think it's a great picture. David reveals to us perhaps the biggest struggle of the human heart, at least one that I see people struggling with, one I struggle with myself. And so let me just jump in, make a couple observations, and we will see where it takes us. So it says this. It says, "Answer me when I call to you, my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. How long will you people turn my glory into shame? And how long will you love delusion and seek false gods? Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Tremble and do not sin. When you are on your bed, search your hearts and be silent. Offer the sacrifices of the righteous and trust in the Lord. Many, Lord, are asking, who will bring us prosperity? And let the light of your face shine on us. Fill my heart with joy, and when their grain and new wine abound. And in peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety." And so, just a couple observations simply from this passage. There's something interesting that goes on in the first two verses. The first verse is David crying out, "God, I have these prayers for you, but you don't seem to answer. You don't seem to hear me." And then in verse 2, it's God responding, or God's perspective on the situation. And he says, "How long will you people turn my glory into shame? And how long will you love delusions and seek false gods?" And so at the very beginning of the psalm, you have these two perspectives. You have the perspective of humanity, where it seems as if God isn't listening or that he isn't there. And so oftentimes we can find ourselves in prayer, we can find ourselves in places, and it doesn't feel like God's hearing us, it doesn't feel like God's answering us. And it's in those moments where we don't hear God that oftentimes our hearts will turn to something else to satisfy or fulfill or meet the need that we have in that given moment. In those moments, God answers, or God's perspective in those moments is simply this: how long will you people turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? And so, in the midst of the silence, you and I are very quick to turn to false gods. And we don't have idols, we don't have physical idols, but we have conceptual idols. We have idols that we turn to meet the needs of our lives, whether it's ourselves and our own work ethic, whether it's relationships, whether it's money, drugs, sex, whatever it may be. We have things that we turn to meet the needs of our lives. And it's in those moments God says, man, you're trading out. You're trading out my glory that I gave you for shame. And so how do we deal with that? How do we struggle with that? I think David gives us a picture of how to navigate that kind of tension. he first says in verse 3, he says, know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself, that the Lord hears when I call to him. So David reminds himself in that tension that God hears us. That even though we may not feel like he's responding, that he hears us because he has set us apart as his faithful servants. And you and I, we have the benefit of the obedience of Jesus, that we reap the benefit of his life. And so when God sees us, he sees Christ in some way. His life covers over ours, like we talked about yesterday. And so in that we can know that God hears us. With that being said, he then gives us, I think, some practical principles that we can use in the midst of these things. The first simply being, we have to examine our lives. He says, tremble and do not sin. And when you are on your bed, search your hearts and be silent. And I think something really important for the Christian to learn to do is simply to constantly be examining themselves, their hearts. Is my heart in alignment with God? Am I focusing on him, or am I seeking false idols? And so we have to examine our lives. The second thing he says in verse 5, he says, offer the sacrifices of the righteous and trust in the Lord. And so you and I, we don't offer sacrifices like they would in the Old Testament. But the sacrifices that you and I do offer is our lives. Paul says to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. And the way that we can do that is we can praise God with worship. And we can serve the world around us. And that those are sacrifices that are pleasing to the Lord. And even David talks about that for God, he desires obedience. And so we have to do that. We offer ourselves as a sacrifice. The next thing he says is that many will be asking, who will bring us prosperity? That there are many of us who will ask that question, who brings prosperity to our lives? And that in those moments when we have that temptation of seeing other people receiving good things, that we have to seek God's face. We have to seek the Lord in those things. He continues and says, fill my heart with joy when their grain and new wine abound. That so when other people that perhaps are living outside of a life with God are blessed, that in those moments we can't be envious, we can't be bitter, but we have to seek joy, we have to rejoice. And I would argue that can we be happy for those who receive the blessing? The scriptures talk about that God brings the rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous, and since he blesses all people. And that when we live this kind of a way, in that tension, it says in verse 8 that in peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. And I think that in that tension that we talked about at the beginning, that if we can learn to examine ourselves, to trust and praise God, to worship, to seek his face, to choose joy, that when we do those things, we can find peace. Because that's going to line our hearts up with God. It's going to put us in his presence. And it's in his presence that we find peace. So, what does that look like for you today? What's the invitation for you? What's the challenge, perhaps? And so, be thinking about that. Hope you guys have a great day. We will see you tomorrow. Blessings. Love you. Bye.